really wish it was January 21st right now. I don't, like, I'm obviously hoping for a particular outcome for every election, not just presidency, but we have a Senate race in Kansas. We have our representatives up for election in Kansas, as well as a myriad of state and local officials. State senators, state reps, local government, city councilors. I don't believe our Ellis County Sheriff is up for election this cycle, but city treasurer, county treasurer, they're all up for election. I haven't looked at any ballot initiatives. Anyone seen anything yet? But bottom line, I want it to be January 21st because that way I can stop seeing political ads on YouTube and Hulu. I'm also going to say that the deadline for voter registration is coming up. Remember, I'm giving everyone 10 points of extra credit if they send me proof of their voter registration. I don't need to see political party. I don't want to see political party. If you declared one, good for you, go for it. But I'm not saying you have to. I'm not a member of a political party. That gives you any idea. Okay. But I'd like to have that into me by October 2nd, which is the date of your guys' first exam. That's next week, by the way, next Friday. So please keep that in mind.
It's going to be open on Friday and be open until Sunday night.
Yep. Because I'm an idiot and made all my exams open at the same time. So I'm going to have just a shit ton of grading. Just an absolute shitload. And that is a technical term. It means I have like 50 some odd tests to grade at one time. So, I guess it sucks for Arius and anyone who's in multiple of my classes because, again, I'm an idiot and scheduled all my exams on the same day, which means I kind of fucked you guys over, didn't I?
It'll be all right.
We'll forgive you.
All right. Yeah. So, anyone got anything? I saw that most of you did your guys' discussion boards. I apologize for not reminding you that they were due last night. If you did not do one or do your discussion board, please email me. I'll allow you to turn it in if you turn it in by Wednesday. Okay? Because I forgot to remind you, and I feel kind of like a dick about it. So, yeah. As far as your guys' exam, I will post the study guide this Friday. I just want to remind you guys, your exam is essay based, and I will like put in there, but basically I want around like 3 to 6 sentences per response per essay question. And what I will do is I will allow you guys to pick which questions you respond to. I'm gonna figure it out in Blackboard, how I'm gonna do that. So everyone be aware. It may come down to like I put all the questions in Blackboard and then I just count, I'll manually enter the grade. Okay, so that's me talking on the back end, how I'm going to work your exam. You will be able to choose what questions you respond to, okay? I will figure out how it works, okay? So, anyone got anything before we get started?
In events yesterday, subway car was derailed. 125 people on the train. No one died, but like 3 were injured. I don't know if they haven't talked to the guy yet to see why he decided to do that, but they haven't.
Say that, the first part again?
In NYC, like the subway was derailed. Somebody put planks on the tracks.
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, happened yesterday.
Huh.
They don't know motive or anything, but people just don't do it.
Okay, so
Possible terrorism?
did you guys online hear that?
I didn't hear it very well. Coins on the tracks? Is that what I heard?
Clamps, right?
Clamps.
Somebody basically put clamps on a subway track and derailed a subway in New York City. 3 injured, 127 people involved. No deaths, thankfully. So I guess I'm going to put it to the class. Would you consider that terrorism? Or I guess, first question, how would you determine whether what that guy did was terrorism? I'm assuming guy.
Why it did it.
Okay, you'd have to look at why.
We know why he
Paul said they didn't know yet.
Yeah, they just, I think they brought him into custody or they already know who it is.
Okay, so they've already identified the individual responsible. They are, if they haven't already brought him into custody, they're trying to do so now. What?
You'd have to look at the 127 people on board and figure out if there's really any person worth targeting in a terrorist act, like a political motivation or
Okay,
otherwise.
so trying to determine if there's a political actor on the train. Zach,
Or, you see, like, is the ethnic makeup of passengers on the train?
okay,
Because it could be out of like a specific neighborhood.
all right.
That was Bronx. Well, at least the guy who did it was from the Bronx. I didn't see what the train was.
Okay. So take a look at ethnic makeup of passengers or the neighborhood itself. See if it was like bias related.
Look at the Facebook page, who he likes, who he says.
Okay. Social media. See if he's involved in any kind of like I guess, mass transit or anti particular race or pro any particular race. What would it take for you to rule out terrorism? I guess from an investigative standpoint.
Maybe him and his girlfriend broke up, and his girlfriend wasn't paying. He was trying to get back at her or something.
Okay. See if there was another motive, not quite an ulterior one, but if there was
More
another
personal.
more personal, yeah.
Money.
Money wise, maybe like his friend said, hey, like I'm gonna be late for work. Can you like delay the train so that I have a legit excuse? Like, no shit, like that actually happens all the time. Yeah.
Your friend comes through like that.
Like I'm joking, like I'm hoping like that wasn't like that would be a really sweet friendship to have someone who's willing to risk hundreds of people's lives and commit major felonies and also probably millions of dollars in damages based on a friend asking for help. But that's an innocent motive, right?
I don't know if you should be friends with them or sisters.
Right.
I don't know if I don't want to be friends with them after that. That's what they'll do when they're not your friend.
Oh, that's true.
Any of you guys seen the movie Cable Guy?
Yes.
Love that kid.
Yeah. For those of you who don't, like that's a classic example of an obsessive friendship. Played for laughs and is also like horrifying because Jim Carrey walks that fine line between being like the Mask versus being the guy from what's that really creepy horror movie he was in? Number 23. Thank you. Like, yeah. Or I guess in Batman Forever, like before he puts on the actual Riddler costume and it's just like this obsessed employee with hero worship and then murders his boss. I'm spoiling a 25-year-old movie, sue me.
And then decides to put TV in people's brains for some reason. Mind control, I think it was. It's been a while.
I'd like to bring attention. He doesn't understand the Star Wars reference.
star, and she also just revealed that she's never seen a Batman. Alright, I'm sorry. How are you thinking this?
Yeah, Abby, how are you in criminal justice?
I own 7 of the Batman movies on Blu-ray.
I like that I get called out every time.
Arius hasn't seen Star Wars.
Yeah, I haven't seen Star Wars.
We gotta see Batman.
But he knows. I didn't know about Batman.
Sorry.
I use Star Wars as a reference because it's a cultural touchstone.
I haven't even seen Scarface.
To be honest, I haven't seen Scarface the entire way through. I've seen bits and pieces.
All you need to know is like,
Mainly because Al Pacino creeps me out.
a little friend scene and then we get chocolate like so that's all you have to do.
All right. So, like when we're talking about something like this, I'm going to tie it back to what we're talking about when we talk about like actually predicting radicalization. Like, reason why this is important is because people don't become terrorists overnight. You don't go from like, I'm just a normal everyday person going about my life to I'm strapping on a bomb vest and I'm going to walk into a Subway. Not the restaurant. Yeah, well, I guess it could be a restaurant if you're just against sandwiches. But like, there is a process, okay? Yeah, Joe.
I'm curious, based on the discussion going last night, if you had to put it like terrorism under criminal theory, what would you say?
That's a really good question. I would say it, particularly when we're talking about radicalization, I would say something like differential association theory. Because as we're going to talk about, and as the readings like for this week have kind of made clear, peer groups really matter. And differential association theory is all about how you associate with different people and how it leads to you learning different behaviors. There's obviously a gender component. Males are much more likely to commit violent acts of terrorism. Females are much more likely to commit acts of sabotage, particularly like nonviolent sabotage.
Like what?
Well, if you like get on 9gag or Reddit or something like that, and you like look up people who like gone through breakups, unfortunately, males are much more likely to take violent action, like domestic violence, kill pets, threaten lives, get restraining orders. Females are much more likely to destroy stuff. Like, who keys people's cars?
Carry over.
Thank you. So a major Sex and the City character, a feminist or a female icon. I wouldn't call her a feminist. I don't know. I don't know the ethics or I guess belief structure of Carrie Underwood. But like just me seeing shit randomly on the internet, like I see a lot of posts that say my girlfriend keyed my car, and or I saw a post a couple days ago about an ex who like keyed someone's like boots because he didn't have a car. It's just like weird shit like that. But long story short, there is a gender component. Males are much more likely to commit acts of violence than females. There is a ideological component. Different ideologies encourage different actions, different behaviors, different targets, different restrictions on behavior. But when it comes down to it, when we are talking about what criminological theory best predicts terrorism, I'm going to say differential association theory. Now, what predicts terrorist acts, I'm going to lean on my old standby, routine activities theory. Because when we're getting into how do you predict a terror attack, you look for vulnerabilities and you address those vulnerabilities. This is the reason why we have all that security theater in airports. It's not actually effective. Yeah, like there are videos out on the internet disproving the fact that TSA is actually effective.
Can't they get guns through like 95% of the time?
like guns, explosives, things that look like bombs or explosives, like old-timey alarm clock with red cylinders. Like,
My God, if you have a water bottle.
people get water bottles through all the time. I've done that. Like, this is a bit of an aside, and I apologize, but like, I use a safety razor to shave, which means I get like little razor blades and I attach them to a physical razor and I shave my face. I've gotten that through TSA like 6 times, carrying like literal razor blades. When I was deploying, they allowed me to take my scalpels, my needles, and my surgical scissors, but took my trauma shears, the ones that are blunted. I could cut people's clothes with trauma shears. I could slice up half the passengers with scalpels.
Is that for all countries or just one?
Oh, that was in Japan.
Okay. So like other countries have more like
The Israelis, I think, do it the best. Like they, for every passenger, from what I've heard, I've never traveled to Israel or used their airways, but from what I hear, they make you open up and test everything. So your camera, they turn it on, they take a picture. Your laptop, they turn it on, it boots up. They go through everything. Okay. Okay. Is that making sense? So when we talk about like radicalization, remind me what I mean by that. What does radicalization mean? Okay, the process of becoming a radical. Okay, when we talk about a radical, we're saying an extremist. Okay, like you can be a radical anything. Okay, we can call a radical vegan someone who like avoids animal products and everything. Does not wear any wool or animal products like leather. Will refuse to eat at a place that serves meat or eggs. I think in this town is like everything except the shake shop on 11th. I want to say, which would really suck. But like, you can be a radical anything. You can be a radical sports fan. Okay. The difference between being a radical and being a terrorist is what? The willingness or the ability or having committed a crime in the service of your ideology. Okay. So when we talk about the radicalization process, most research has focused on how someone becomes each of these. A radical, someone who's on the far end, an extremist, someone who's in the very, very tip of the end of the spectrum. And then a terrorist, someone who commits an act in support of that ideology, okay? So what radicalization also looks at is what makes people start this process, okay? As we talked about last week and the week before, this borrows a lot from social psychology and political science. How do people form political beliefs? But also we have to look at how can we predict who is going to become an extremist, okay? So our key questions with this is, how do we predict what groups are going to become extremists? Okay. Can you give me an example? Can you think of a group that started small and then became a terrorist group?
The
What?
KKK.
Okay, give me an example. Like, walk me through the process, I guess.
Like during the right before the equal rights movement, they were a relatively small organization. And then during that time, it just exploded into massive nationwide.
Okay, so the KKK, by and large, has existed since the end of the Civil War. But its membership has fluctuated radically depending on what is going on in the country. So when there weren't massive growth in civil rights, fewer people felt the need to join the KKK. Okay. So we also have to look at social movements. Like, why did Al-Qaeda commit airplane hijackings and ram into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and try to blow up the White House? What were the antecedents of that attack? What came before? I guess I should say. Do not say they hated us because of our freedoms.
Wasn't it partially because of Desert Storm?
Yeah. We had American troops, non-Muslims, around holy sites in Saudi Arabia. Okay. That was considered an affront to Islam in that radical Wahhabist interpretation of Islam. Most Muslims don't care. Even the more hardline ones were like, okay, you can be there, but you can't have any alcohol, please, and thank you. All right. But then you had that very radical set, I believe it's called Wahhabism, that had a very strict and exclusionary interpretation of Islam. Okay. So when we think about group processes, we have to understand, well, how did the group react to this? Like America, United States governments, particularly in the 70s or 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even before that, had a history of propping up repressive regimes. We sold weapons to the Iranians, the Iraqis. We're still selling weapons to the Saudis, Yemenis, like everyone in the Middle East we've sold or are currently selling weapons to. Okay. We sold weapons to what became the Taliban. Like, we have to understand how not only do groups form, but how do they react to social environments? Make sense? We also have to understand how individuals decide to join those groups. Anyone know a vegetarian or a vegan besides me? Okay, so why do those people become vegetarian or vegan? Okay. Health reasons? Sympathetic towards animals, that's my wife's answer. What about people who don't drink, even though they're of age?
They could have had a problem in the past and they don't want to mess with it anymore.
They abstain because they had a bad experience? Religious reasons?
Family stuff.
They have a family history of alcohol abuse? Anyone know anyone who will go into a bar with an axe and just start breaking shit up?
Not personally.
They're not racist.
Yeah, you guys had the privilege of not knowing my grandmother. Anyone know who Carrie Nation was? One of the leaders, for those of you who are unaware, one of the leaders of the abstinence movement, not sex abstinence, but abstinence from alcohol. Prohibition, excuse me. I used the actual correct term. One of the leaders of the prohibition movement. She would go into bars and say, close down. And if the bar didn't close down, she would come back with a hatchet and start breaking shit. Okay. You can think of Carrie Nation as a terrorist. Okay. Because her beliefs led her to commit acts of terror. She threatened, she then committed crimes to support a political agenda. Nice pun, thank you. Okay. So this discussion builds on what we've already talked about concerning how we actually define what terrorism, extremism, and radicalization mean. And it also builds on how we actually go about measuring terror attacks. Has anyone thought of someone like Carrie Nation as a terrorist?
A little bit.
A little on the nut side, but like she fits our definition. Anyone familiar with the history of World War II?
I mean, when it's a whole Nazi regime,
Okay.
like you have the 9/11.
Yeah, it was a political group that went about terrorizing other political groups.
Yeah, we did state sponsored by Germany.
Yeah, and then when they took over the government, they did the same thing to other nations. What about the French resistance, the Maquis? Widely and correctly considered to be heroes. They killed Nazis. Still a terrorist, still a group of terrorists. They killed French citizens probably as often as they killed Germans because they considered them to be collaborators. Remember, when we talk about terrorism, we're looking at the act or the process of becoming a terrorist. We're not levying a moral judgment. Okay.
With like Confederate soldiers, is that not terrorism because like they declared war already?
I would consider Confederate soldiers to not be terrorists, just as I would consider Nazi soldiers to not be terrorists. Nazis who committed acts of violence in service of their political agenda outside of the armed forces would be considered terrorists.
Because it's like a war setting conflict.
Right. All the partisans on both sides, like everyone in here knows who Jesse James was, right? Famous outlaw, was a Confederate war veteran. He was never a part of the Confederate Army. He was an irregular person. What that means is he did not join the military. He took his weapons from home and started rampaging throughout Missouri and the Associated States, killing Union soldiers, Union sympathizers, and terrorizing supply lines. He was a terrorist. Yeah,
Just,
Zach.
about to ask about that. What about a group? So I can only think of fiction, but they could do it in World War II. The Glorious Bastards, that group of guys that are technically military, technically being ordered to do it, but
I would consider them to be military members committing war crimes. If you carve a Nazi symbol into someone's head, alive or dead, that is considered torture and is a war crime. It was a war crime then, too. Yeah, Paul.
Okay, so wasn't the attack on Pearl Harbor technically a terrorist attack? And did they already declare war at that point?
They had not, but it was a military on military. Okay. This is a very useful thing because if we broaden the definition of terrorism too much, then it becomes useless. Right. Remember when we talked about terrorism first week and second week, it is individuals or groups who are acting either against the law or acting against another country without declaring a war. So if there can be state-sponsored terrorist groups, like Iran sponsors Hezbollah in other countries, and Hamas, I believe. That is considered state-sponsored terrorism because Iran is just funding them through money, training, intelligence, and the group is still members of that ethnic or that country, that ethnic group, whatever, and they're committing acts of terrorism within that country. If it was Iran sending members of its armed forces to this other country to kill military officials, then I would say that kind of skirts the line a little bit. That making sense? But that's a really important thing. That's how do we get into categorizing groups? Anyone familiar with the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets? You've heard of them? Like, one of their key jobs is to be sent into an area and to train members of a group to fight. That's one of their key jobs. It's right up there with the Navy SEALs being like, yeah, we swim and we go blow up things. That's a key part of the SEALs. Not just, you know, killing bin Laden and things like that. Okay, so we can define them as members of the armed forces, but if they're ever caught, the country that they're operating in would likely call them a terrorist because they're going in and training insurgents. Make sense? So what this boils down to is that we have three basic ways of understanding the radicalization process. Okay, we can look at it from the individual perspective, meaning what makes individuals terrorists. We can look at it from the group perspective and look at what types of groups or what beliefs or what factors may make a group more likely to become terrorists or radicalized. What can push them further down the process, okay? And then we can also look at nations, right? How do conditions within the country affect what type of terrorist behavior occurs? Make sense? Does anyone know what a failed state is? Anyone heard that term in the news or something? Yeah, I mean, basically, it's a government that fails to provide services or security. Okay, Somalia and the Sudan could be considered failed states because they cannot adequately control their borders. People can come in and out without question. They cannot provide basic services. And in many instances, particularly when we get into like the history of Somalia from like 1985-ish forward, different groups have maintained control over the country. Yeah, there it is.
Rwanda, is that what it is? Is that like a situation where they couldn't control what was going on?
I would consider that more like a civil war could be considered a failed state because you have a government that is fighting against its people. It's a I would consider that to be a type of failed state because you no longer have the ability to maintain consensus. Okay. But again, this is one of those areas where, like, when we take a look at what makes a state or a nation a failed state, what types of things happen there? Does a country being occupied by a foreign power, like France in the 1940s, Iraq, and Afghanistan in the 2000s and on, what about that makes people more likely to fight back?
They don't trust the government anymore.
You don't trust the government anymore. They feel like the government is not in their control. They may have witnessed an atrocity or been a victim of it. Like, kind of making sense?
It goes with the economical.
Economic as well.
No, Venezuela.
France and
Getting into the reign of terror there. Venezuela now, like I don't think the situation in Venezuela has devolved to the point where it would be considered a full-blown failed state because you still have a government. But that's like, we may actually be watching a state fail in real time in your guys' lifetime. There are parts of even Mexico where the government has no control. It is controlled by the drug cartels.
What about the city of Minneapolis? It's like the first 3 days of June. That was no one could control anything. And there was riots. And whatever they wanted to do.
I mean, again, that comes down to what do we consider to be a failed state? A city, I don't know if we can consider that to be a state. Particularly, like when it comes down to Minneapolis, control was reestablished fairly quickly. Like the National Guard came in, there was reduced unrest. Okay. And again, this comes down to how do we define what is a failed state? Because if a failed state is protest, the United States failed in like 1783 with the Whiskey Rebellion. What was 83? My early American history is not as strong as I thought, guys.
I didn't know that was a Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah, that was the first, like, farmers in the Americas basically said, the government wants to tax our booze. Hell no. You guys can raise taxes in other areas. Let us get fucked up. So a bunch of American Revolutionary veterans took up arms against the government, and George Washington, while he was president, led troops against them. I don't think there was actually any full-blown fighting, but that was very, very, very close to an armed insurrection.
Did you say the Seattle earlier? Like they actually like push the troops down? Like
Their autonomous zone, like
the autonomous zone?
I wouldn't consider that to be a failed state, just because like the city government decided, hey, let's back off, let's give them space.
it'd be reasonable to say though, then that like, if it's truly a failed state, there is no recovery in terms of like let's say Minneapolis was a failed state, but Minneapolis doesn't take back over. Like, would that define it then? As like
Again, I don't know,
not being able to regain control ever?
because to me, a failed state implies a nation. Because a city doesn't really have control over who comes in and out. And there are other government agencies like state government, federal government that can come in and render those services the city can't. Because otherwise we would consider Detroit to be a failed state since like 2009. Because
Not much of that. What if it was DC instead of Indianapolis? That's way more important, I feel like. It's not really, it's a city, but it's really like a district. Yeah.
A protectorate.
Yeah.
Like, again, this comes down to how do we define what the hell is going on? Because we have a state being like a distinct geopolitical boundary, like a city or a state, capital state like Kansas, or a nation. Like what we consider to be a failed state is going to change depending on how we define what a geopolitical state is.
You have to put whoever was in control in front of the state that was failed, because otherwise it's just always going to remain a failed state regardless, even though somebody else takes over control. So it would have to be, let's say, like the United States completely falls for some reason. Protests are up all over, and Trump is kicked out of office.
Okay.
Is that Donald Trump's failed state of the United States, or is that
I would consider it to be like, I guess here's my definition, and I think this is kind of the last thing we've got for today. My definition of a failed state would be, even if there is a national level government, services are not being rendered. Okay. So governments, by definition, exist to control the population through the criminal justice system, civil law system. They control borders, and they also render services. Water, power, medicine, response to emergencies. Okay. So a state can fail because it is at war with itself, so it's unable to exert control. It can also fail because national government cannot render services outside of the capital or specific districts. So depending on how you look at it, Somalia could have a failed state because warlords or terrorist groups, or Ethiopia even, control different aspects of its territory. Okay. We don't really need to spend a lot of time on failed states because it's comparatively, they are few in number. Like off the top of my head, Sudan, maybe, Iraq, maybe, Afghanistan, maybe, Somalia, maybe, Venezuela, maybe. That's basically it across the planet that meet the definition of a government that cannot render services to the vast majority of its population. Okay. But again, depends on how we're defining services, population, and state. Sorry, I know it's itchy. All right, go ahead and end the share. Anyone got anything? Kind of sucks not having a clock over there. I apologize for keeping you guys late. So I'll get you guys a study guide by the end of the week. If you guys have any questions, by all means, let me know. All right.
Sounds good. We'll see you around still.
See ya.